There are men who carry secrets the way other men carry scars, quietly, deeply, and forever. You never see the weight. You only notice, if you look close enough, that they never quite sleep all the way. That their eyes move even when the rest of them is still. That they flinch at certain kinds of quiet, the kind that arrives just before something breaks. Dennis Greaves was one of those men. He had worked the gates of Earl Haig Gardens for 22 years. 22 years of the same iron fence, the same gravel path, the same slow turn of seasons across the same stretch of manicured English ground. He had watched children grow into teenagers who stopped looking at him when they passed. He had watched old men arrive with walking sticks and leave without them, and then stop arriving altogether. He had watched the world outside the gates change, the cars, the phones, the faces, while inside, time moved the way it always had inside places like this. Slowly, with ceremony, with a kind of dignity that the outside world had largely stopped bothering with. He was not a famous man. He would have hated that. He wore his uniform the way a person wears a decision. Not because it looked good, but because he had made a choice long ago about what kind of man he intended to be, and the uniform was simply the visible part of that. Collar straight, buttons right, shoes the kind of clean that doesn't happen by accident. People who passed him every day for years could not have told you his last name. That is the way of men like Dennis. The world builds its monuments to the loud ones. The ones who stepped forward, who gave speeches, who made sure their name was in the room when the story was being told. Men like Dennis, the ones who stood at the edge of the room and made sure the room was safe. Those men disappear from the record almost as soon as the event is over. Not because what they did didn't matter, because nobody thought to write it down. This is an attempt to write it down. Earl Haig Gardens sits in the London borough of Haringey in Wood Green. If you don't know it, you could walk past it and feel nothing particular. A housing estate built for veterans and their families, named for Field Marshal Douglas Haig, one of the most controversial British military figures of the First World War. There's a certain irony in that. A place meant to shelter the men who had given everything, named for the man many blamed for asking too much of them. But that kind of irony is old in England. It doesn't surprise anyone anymore. The buildings are mostly low-rise, the grounds kept neat, and over the years the community has developed the particular texture that comes when a place has held enough grief to become something heavier than just housing. It holds memory. It holds the kind of quiet that forms around people who have learned not to speak about the worst things they have seen. Dennis arrived there in the early 1980s. He had come out of a working-class background in North London, the kind of upbringing where you learn the value of showing up before you learned almost anything else. His father had worked the docks. His mother had done other people's laundry and made it seem like a dignified profession because she approached it that way. He had done a short period of military service. Nothing he talked about, nothing he told stories about at the pub, and then come back to London and needed work, and the gate position at Earl Haig Gardens had been offered to him by a man who knew his uncle, the way most things in working-class North London were arranged in those years. He took the job. He didn't know, standing at that gate for the first time in his freshly ironed uniform, that he would still be standing there 2 decades later. You never do. People take jobs thinking they're temporary and then look up one day and realize the job has become their life, and then they have to decide whether that is a tragedy or simply the truth of how lives are built. Not in grand chosen moments, but in small, repeated ones. Dennis came to believe it was the truth of it. He stopped thinking of himself as a man temporarily guarding a gate and started thinking of himself as a man whose job was to hold a space, to be the thing that stood between the residents and whatever the world outside wanted to throw at them. Veterans, widows, elderly people who had given their best years to a country that had moved on without waiting for a thank you. These were his people. He didn't use language like that. He would have found it embarrassing. But he felt it. In the daily way he knew everyone's schedule, in the extra minute he took when Mrs. Kowalski was struggling with her shopping bags, in the way he stood a little straighter when a resident was passing through with company, wanting them to feel that the place they called home had standards, had dignity, had someone at the door who took the responsibility of that seriously. He was not a man with a big personality. He was a man with a big presence. There's a difference. Big personalities fill rooms with noise. Big presences fill rooms with a kind of steadiness that makes everyone slightly less afraid. He had a daughter, Mara, who he raised mostly alone after his wife left in the late 80s. He didn't talk about that either. Mara remembered later that her father never spoke badly about her mother, not once, and that she had found this more bewildering as an adult than she had as a child. As a child, it had just seemed like the way things were. As an adult, she understood that it was a choice made deliberately every single day, and that the making of it must have cost him something. He was that kind of man. The kind who chose what he showed you and what he swallowed, and who seemed to have decided very early that dignity was not something that could be taken from you, only surrendered. The Gardens had its rhythms. Dennis knew them all. Deliveries on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. The GP visiting on Wednesdays. The occasional visit from local officials, counselors, welfare workers, people who arrived with clipboards and left with reports that probably described the place accurately without ever capturing it. And then there were the other visits, the bigger ones, the ones that arrived with different cars and different energy and a certain tension in the air that Dennis had learned to read the way a sailor reads the sky before a storm. Royal visits were not frequent, but they happened. Earl Haig Gardens, given its veteran population and its symbolic weight, occasionally received attention from the palace. These visits were coordinated through channels that Dennis was only partially included in. He would receive notice, sometimes generous, sometimes maddeningly brief, that dignitaries would be arriving, and his job was to ensure the gate was managed appropriately, access controlled, the immediate perimeter of the entrance secure and presentable. He had managed several such visits over the years. He was good at them. He understood the protocol without having been formally trained in it, the way people who pay close enough attention eventually absorb the grammar of the world they live in. He knew when to speak and when to stand still. He knew that the people who arrived in those cars were not visiting him. They were visiting the residents, the community, the idea of the place, and that his job was to be invisible in the right way. Present. Useful. Not in the picture. He had shaken hands once with a minor royal, years before the event this story is about. He had not mentioned it to anyone except Mara, and even to her he had framed it as a footnote to a story about something else, so that she almost missed it. That was Dennis. The visit that changed his life, that lodged itself inside him like a splinter too deep to reach, came in a year that had already been difficult. The country was in one of its periodic states of mourning for things that had passed. The veteran community at Earl Haig Gardens was aging, the original residents giving way to their children and grandchildren, the sense of shared sacrifice that had once been the estate's invisible connective tissue growing thinner, more attenuated, as the people who had lived it gave way to the people who had only heard about it. There was talk of redevelopment. There was always talk of redevelopment in places like this. The talk hung over the estate like weather that hadn't broken yet. Princess Anne's visit was not announced in the newspapers. It was not a public engagement in the way that some royal appearances are public. There were no crowds arranged at the gates, no children with small flags, no photographer from the Nationals. It was quieter than that, more personal. The Princess Royal had a long association with veteran welfare work, a sustained and genuine commitment to the people who had served that was less glamorous than some of her siblings' charitable profiles and more consistent. She came to see people. She came to sit with them, to listen, to be present in the way that the old residents of Earl Haig Gardens understood, not the kind of presence that performs itself, but the kind that simply is. Dennis received notice 48 hours before the visit. It was enough time to prepare, but not quite enough time to stop being nervous, which surprised him. He was not a nervous man. He had stood at that gate through arguments and small crises and the low-grade human drama of a community that lived close together under the weight of shared hardship, and he had not been nervous for any of it. But there was something about this visit that settled differently in him, and he couldn't explain it, and so he didn't try. He pressed his uniform the night before with more than his usual care. He polished his shoes until Mara, who was staying with him that week, told him she could see herself in them, and could he please stop because it was getting a bit unsettling. He laughed. It was a short laugh, and then he went back to polishing. The morning of the visit was cold. One of those March mornings that has given up the pretense of being the beginning of spring and decided to simply be a continuation of winter with a different name. Dennis arrived at the gate 30 minutes before his shift formally started, which was what he always did because he believed that 30 minutes early was actually on time, and on time was already slightly late, and this was not a day to be slightly anything. He stood at his post. He watched the quiet street. He felt the particular quality of waiting that comes before something you cannot fully predict. And then the car arrived. It was not a long motorcade. There was none of the spectacle that the word royal visit might conjure in someone who had never experienced one of these quieter engagements. 2 cars. Discreet. The people inside them dressed to be present without being ostentatious. Dennis opened the gate with the practiced ease of a man who had opened it 10,000 times, and the car passed through, and for a moment Princess and looked out the window, and their eyes met, and she gave him the kind of direct, unperformative nod that is the greeting of someone who has spent decades around people who do invisible necessary work and has learned to see them. He felt seen. He hadn't expected that. He didn't know what to do with it. He closed the gate behind the car and stood at his post and breathed the cold March air and thought about nothing in particular, which was what he always did when something had moved him more than he wanted to show. Inside the gardens, the visit proceeded. Dennis was not privy to most of it. He was at the gate. That was where he was supposed to be, and that was where he stayed. He heard fragments, voices from the direction of the main hall, the low hum of the visit in progress, the particular quality of sound that happens when a small space is holding something larger than its usual daily life. And then, toward the end of the visit, something shifted. The details of what happened next, what Dennis heard, what was said in that corridor that connected the hall to the entrance of the main building, are not something that entered the public record. They never have. They exist only in the memory of the man who was standing close enough to hear, who was there because his job put him at the edge of things, in the place between inside and outside, which is exactly where a man like Dennis always stood. He heard her voice, clear and steady and carrying the particular weight of words that are not being performed for anyone. He heard what she said, and something in him, the part that had stood at gates for 22 years absorbing the weight of other people's lives, the part that knew how to hold something without letting it show, understood immediately that what he had just heard was not meant for the public, not meant for the record, not meant for the story that would later be told about this visit in the channels and reports and brief press releases. It was meant for the person she was speaking to, a resident, an old man who had served in a war that the country had mostly finished thinking about by the time the century turned. It was private. It was human. It was the kind of thing that a person says when they have stopped performing the role and are simply for a moment a person talking to another person about something real. Dennis heard it. He did not write it down. He did not tell anyone. He stood at his gate and he held it the way he held everything, carefully and alone and without needing anyone to know that he was holding it. The cars left. The morning returned to its usual shape. The gravel path was quiet. The iron gate was closed. Dennis stood at his post for the rest of his shift, and if anyone had looked at him carefully, they might have noticed that something had settled in him that had not been there before. Not peace exactly, but something adjacent to it. The particular quality of a man who has witnessed something true and understood that the witnessing itself was enough. That he didn't need to do anything with it except carry it. He was good at carrying things. He had been doing it his whole life. The years after that visit did not announce themselves as significant. They came the way years mostly come, in ordinary clothes, carrying ordinary weight, looking nothing like the chapters of a story from the outside. Dennis kept his post. The gate kept turning. The gravel kept its color through the seasons, going pale and dry in the summer, dark and matted in the winter rains, and Dennis stood at the center of it all the way he always had, reliable as a fixed point on a map. But Something had changed, not in the visible things, not in the way he greeted people, or pressed his uniform, or polished his shoes to that particular standard that Mara still found slightly alarming. Not in the routine of his days, which continued with the same rhythmic precision that had made him the kind of man residents relied on without thinking about it. The way you rely on gravity, or the sound of the 7 a.m. bus, or the particular creaking of a familiar house. Those things didn't change. What changed was harder to name. He had started listening differently. That was the closest he ever came to describing it, in the single conversation he eventually had about that March morning. The words came slowly, like he was pulling them out of somewhere they had been lodged for a long time. He said he had always been a listener. Part of the job. You stood at a gate, you heard what passed through, you filtered it. But after that visit, something had opened up in the listening that he hadn't expected. He started to hear the things under the things people said. The silences in the middle of sentences. The words people chose when they were trying not to say the words they actually meant. He thought about the old man who had been in that corridor. The one princess and had been speaking to. His name was Albert Osei. Dennis had known him for years. Not well, in the way that you know a neighbor's full life and history, but in the way that a gatekeeper knows everyone who passes through regularly. Albert was 81 years old at the time of the visit. He was from Ghana originally, had come to England after the war as part of a generation of Commonwealth men who had fought for a crown that did not always remember them afterward with the same enthusiasm it had recruited them with. He had been at Earl Haig Gardens for over a decade by then. He was small, slight, with a particular kind of physical economy that some elderly people develop. No wasted movement, no unnecessary gesture, as if the body has learned to ration itself. He walked with 2 sticks by that point, and the walk was slow, but there was nothing uncertain about it. He knew exactly where he was going. He always had. Dennis had exchanged perhaps a few dozen full conversations with Albert over the years. Mostly they existed in the register of the small daily acknowledgement, a nod, a word about the weather, occasionally a comment about something on the news that they had both processed in the particular way that men of their generation processed news, which was with a kind of dry, almost affectionate contempt for the people making the decisions. Albert had a sense of humor that was so dry it occasionally went unrecognized as humor until several seconds after it had landed. Dennis loved this about him, without ever having said so. In the weeks after the royal visit, Dennis noticed something about Albert. He noticed it the way he noticed most things, obliquely, from the corner of his attention, without making a performance of the noticing. Albert was still walking his usual route to the day room and back, still moving with that same deliberate economy. But something in the set of his shoulders had shifted, and once or twice Dennis caught him standing near the entrance of the main building in a way that was slightly different from his usual movement through space. Not waiting, not going anywhere, just standing, looking at the middle distance with an expression that Dennis had learned to recognize over 22 years at that gate. It was the expression of a person who has been heard. Not helped, necessarily. Not fixed, but heard. The specific and surprisingly rare experience of having said something true about your life and having it received by another human being who did not immediately try to reframe it or repackage it or hurry it along to somewhere more comfortable. Just received it, held it for a moment, acknowledged that it was real. Dennis had not heard the entirety of what Princess and had said to Albert in that corridor. He had heard enough. He had heard the specific quality of a voice speaking without the usual protective layer between the speaker and the thing being spoken. He had heard Albert respond. A few words, low and rough and not composed for anyone, and he had heard the silence that followed, which was not an empty silence, but a full one, the kind of silence that forms when 2 people have arrived briefly at the same understanding. He didn't know what had been said before he arrived within earshot. He didn't know what had been said after he moved back to give them distance. He knew only the fragment he had witnessed, and he held it the way he held the other fragments of other people's lives that his position placed him close to, as something that was not his, but that he was responsible for protecting. This became a kind of private weight that he carried for many years without understanding exactly why. He was not a man who sought meaning in things, Or at least he would have said that about himself, and it was mostly true. He was practical. He believed in showing up, in doing the job, in not making things about himself that are not about himself. He was skeptical of people who turned ordinary experiences into lessons or narratives. Life was not a film, he would have said. Things happened, and then other things happened, and you did your best with each of them, and that was it. But the fragment he had witnessed at Earl Haig Gardens that March morning had done something to him that his practical nature had no good framework for. It had made him think about visibility, about which lives get seen and which lives get the quality of being adjacent to the scene, about what it meant to be Albert Osei, a Commonwealth veteran who had served with real distinction, who had come to England and made a life and raised children who had gone on to build their own lives, who had outlived most of the people who would have been able to confirm the full shape of everything he had endured and offered, and to have the gap between his life and the official story of it acknowledged briefly by someone whose acknowledgement carried weight. He thought about this on his bus ride home. He thought about it while making his dinner. He thought about it, finally, one evening sitting in his chair with the television on and the sound turned low, and he arrived at something that he would not have called a conclusion because he distrusted conclusions. He would have called it an understanding. The understanding was this: some of the most important things that ever happen in a place happen at its edges. In the corridor, not the hall. At the gate, not inside. To the people who stand between the official story and the thing that actually occurs. And those things leave almost no trace. They exist only in the memory of whoever was standing close enough, and when that person goes, the trace goes with them. He was 63 years old. He was not ill, but he was beginning to be the age at which a person starts to notice the shape of what they will leave behind, and he was aware with a particular clarity that came from years of standing at a boundary, that he was in possession of something that had no obvious place to go. He started paying attention to Albert differently after that. Not intrusively. Dennis would rather have lost the memory altogether than intrude on Albert's privacy. But with the specific awareness of someone who understood that there was a person in his community who carried something extraordinary in ordinary clothing, and that the ordinary clothing was in some danger of being all that anyone ever saw. Albert had a daughter named Clara who visited on Sundays. Dennis had seen her dozens of times over the years. A tall woman in her mid-50s, efficient in her movements, clearly competent, clearly loving, clearly navigating the particular exhaustion of caring for an aging parent, while also living her own life in the spaces between the visits. She and Dennis had exchanged Sunday morning pleasantries for years. She knew his name. He knew hers. That was the extent of it. In the autumn of the year after the royal visit, she stopped him at the gate. She didn't quite know how to start what she was trying to say. He could tell. He had seen that particular arrangement of posture and half-formed expression many times. People arriving at a gate with something that didn't quite fit the format of a gate conversation. She stood there for a moment with her hands in her coat pockets and her eyes somewhere to the left of his face, and then she looked directly at him and said, "He told me about you." Dennis waited. She said her father had mentioned him, specifically in the context of the royal visit. Not with any detail. Albert was not a man for detail either, it turned out, but with a kind of acknowledgement. He had told Clara that the man at the gate was the kind of man who understood the difference between watching and seeing. Dennis didn't respond for a moment. He was not sure he trusted his voice to come out at the right register. He said, "He's a good man." Clara nodded. She pulled her coat tighter. Then she said something that landed in Dennis the same way that March morning had landed, carefully, without warning, and too deep to reach. She said, "He doesn't have many people left who remember what he actually did, what he was part of. He has the records, and he has us, but we didn't see it. We only heard about it. And I think it matters to him having someone close by who at least understands what that kind of thing costs." Dennis thought about that conversation for weeks. He thought about the difference between the records and the living memory, about what happens when the people who carry the living memory start to go one by one, and the records are all that's left. Records are accurate in their way. They capture the events, the dates, the names, the official actions. They don't capture the texture of a person. They don't capture the weight of the decision made in the moment before the record was created. They don't capture what a man's face looks like when he has done something that will cost him for the rest of his life, and knows it already, and does it anyway. Albert knew. Albert's face carried that knowledge in the particular set of it, around the eyes and the mouth that Dennis had seen on a handful of other old men his time at Earl Haig Gardens, and recognized without being able to fully articulate what he was recognizing. It was the face of someone who had been asked to pay a price that was too high and had paid it anyway, not because they thought it was fair, but because they thought it was necessary, and who had then had to continue living as though that price was simply the shape of things now. Dennis started visiting Albert. Not officially, not as part of any program or scheme. He simply found, in the months that followed Clara's conversation with him, that his route through the estate on his breaks had shifted slightly, in a direction that happened to take him past the day room where Albert sat in the afternoons when the weather was too cold for the garden. He would stop. They would talk. About nothing in particular. Usually, the news, the state of the roads, the peculiarly English habit of treating weather as a moral failing. Albert was a cricket man. Dennis had very little interest in cricket, but developed a working knowledge of it that he maintained purely for the purpose of these conversations. Albert never mentioned a royal visit directly. Dennis never brought it up, but something had been established between them that required no direct naming. The thing that had been witnessed and held, the thing that the official record would not carry. They sat on either side of it, and it was enough. In the spring of that year, Albert's health began to decline in the incremental and irrevocable way that the health of very old people declines. Not a collapse, but a slow withdrawal, a stepping back from the forward edge of living. He reduced his visits to the day room. The walks became shorter. Clara came more often and for longer. Dennis began to see the shift in her on Sundays too. The particular set of a person preparing themselves for something they cannot stop. One afternoon, on a rare day of actual spring sunshine, Albert was sitting in the small garden area near the entrance when Dennis came by on his break. The old man had his face tilted toward the sun, eyes closed, both hands resting on the heads of his walking sticks. He looked, Dennis thought, like a person who had finished saying everything he needed to say and had arrived at a kind of peace with the silence on the other side of it. Dennis sat on the bench nearby. He didn't say anything. Albert didn't open his eyes. After a while, Albert said, "She understood, you know, what caused to be overlooked by the story you helped to make." Dennis said nothing. He understood that this was not an invitation to respond. It was a man saying something out loud for perhaps the first time to someone who he trusted to hold it without needing to do anything with it. Albert said, "I never expected to be remembered. I stopped expecting that a long time ago. But to have someone look at you and know, not be told, not read the file, just look and know that is something else." He opened his eyes. He looked at the spring light on the garden and did not say anything else. Dennis sat with him for another 20 minutes. They talked about cricket. Dennis made a mildly uninformed observation about a particular batting lineup, and Albert corrected him with the particular pleasure of a man who enjoys being right about small things when the large things have not always gone his way. The sun moved. They sat. When Dennis got up to go back to his post, Albert raised one hand slightly from the head of his walking stick, the smallest of gestures, barely a movement, and Dennis received it as what it was. Enough. Albert Osei died on a Tuesday in November, 9 days after his 84th birthday. Dennis found out the way he found out most things about the people who lived inside the gardens. Not from an official announcement, but from the particular quality of a morning that felt different before he could say why. Clara's car was in the car park at an hour she didn't usually arrive. There was a G-piece vehicle he didn't recognize. And then there was the silence, which was not the absence of noise, but the presence of something that had arrived in the night and settled over the estate with the flat, unmovable weight of a decision that has already been made. He opened the gate for 2 more cars that morning and did not ask any questions. By mid-afternoon, Clara came to find him. She was dry-eyed in the way that people are dry-eyed when they've been crying for hours, and have moved through to the other side of it. Not because the grief is over, but because the body has simply run its budget for tears and is now operating on a different kind of fuel. She stood at the gate and she said, "He went in the night," quietly. And then she looked away at the street, at the ordinary Tuesday of it, and said, "He would have wanted you to know directly." Dennis said, "I'm sorry, Clara." She nodded. She stayed a moment longer than the information required. Then she straightened and pulled her coat closed and went back inside. He stood at his gate for the remaining 4 hours of his shift and let the day go through him. He did not feel, in those hours, what most people would recognize as grief. He felt something adjacent to it, something that occupied the same general space but had a slightly different shape. He felt the particular weight of a person-shaped absence. The awareness that the bench in the garden would be empty in a way it had not been empty before, that Albert's correction of his cricket commentary would not come again, that a certain quality of mourning had passed into the category of things that no longer existed in the present tense. He had stood at enough edges in his life to recognize that quality. He knew what it meant, and he did not fight it. He thought about what Albert had said in the garden that spring afternoon, about being looked at and known, about the difference between the record and the living thing. He thought about the fragment he was still carrying, the words heard in the corridor that March morning, the specific texture of Princess Anne's voice in a moment when she was not performing anything, the silence that followed. He had held it for years now, this fragment, with the practiced care of a man who understood that some things are not his to release, but are also too important to simply let dissolve when he was gone. He began, that winter, to write. This surprised him. He was not a writer. He had never thought of himself as one. He left school at 16 and read for pleasure, but not extensively, and he would have laughed, mildly and without cruelty, at the idea of himself producing anything that deserved to be called prose. But writing was not what this was exactly. It was more like the thing he did at the gate, standing at the edge, taking in what passed, and making sure it was held somewhere. He started with Albert. Not with the royal visit, not with the corridor, not with the fragment. He started with Albert as a man. The way he corrected a cricket commentary, the economy of his body, the 2 sticks and the knowing walk, the Sunday visits and Clara's coat, and the particular dry quality of his humor that arrived like a postcard from somewhere extremely far away. He wrote these things in the notebook Mara had given him 2 Christmases ago as a present he had received with the polite bafflement of a man who does not think of himself as a notebook person, and which had sat on his kitchen table for 2 years holding receipts and a phone number for a plumber. He wrote for an hour on the first night. He read it back. It was not good, in the way that first attempts at honest things are rarely good. Too careful, too rounded off at the edges, too much like a man watching himself write. He crossed most of it out and started again. The second attempt was rawer, less finished. He left it as it was. He wrote through the winter. Not every night. Some nights he was tired in the bone-deep way a man in his mid-60s who has spent decades standing in an open gate in English weather, and he sat in his chair and watched the television with the sound low and let the day dissolve. But often enough. And as he wrote, something strange happened, which was that the writing started to produce things he had not known were in him. Memories that had not seemed significant when they occurred, appearing on the page with a weight he hadn't expected. The morning with Princess and arriving again and again at the edge of what he was writing. Not because he was directing it there, but because the fragment had been lodged in him so long that it had become structural. The way an old fracture becomes part of the skeleton. Not a wound anymore, but a permanent feature of the architecture. He wrote about it eventually. Carefully. He wrote about what he had heard and what he had understood and what he had chosen to do with it, which was nothing for all these years. Nothing except carry it and hold it and understand it as something that had been dropped accidentally into his care by the simple geography of where he stood. He wrote about the quality of her voice in that corridor. Not its content. The content was hers and Albert's and would remain so. But the quality, the thing in it that he had recognized without knowing he recognized it. The stripped-back quality of a person who has, for a moment, set down the version of themselves they maintain in public and is simply speaking. He had heard it before in the garden when Albert had said what he said to the spring light. He had heard it occasionally in all his years at the gate, residents passing through, saying something real in the half-private space between inside and outside, not quite knowing he could hear or knowing and trusting him with it anyway. It was the sound of truth without performance. He understood, writing about it, why it had stayed with him. Not because it was extraordinary, though it was, but because it confirmed something he had spent 22 years at a gate believing without quite being able to prove. That the real things happen at the edges. That the people who stand at the margins of the official story are not less important to its meaning. They're often closer to its center than anyone in the middle of it. That there's a form of witnessing that is not the same as testimony, not the same as journalism or record-keeping, but is its own necessary thing. The holding of what passes through. He thought about what would happen when he was gone. He was not morbid. He was practical. He had reached the age at which practical people think about these things, and he was healthier than most men his age, and he expected to be at his gate for some years yet. But the fragment he was carrying had been Albert's before it was his, had lived in the old man's body for the years between the corridor and that spring garden, carrying its weight in the only place it could, which was inside a person. And now Albert was gone, and Dennis had it, and Dennis would not always be here either. He made a decision. He made it the way he made most decisions, quietly, without announcement, without needing anyone to ratify it. He finished writing what he could of the story. Not the complete story. Some of it was not his to tell, and he drew that line with the same care he brought to everything, but the shape of it, the frame of it, what had happened at Earl Haig Gardens over those years, held together by a gate, a man who stood at it, an old soldier who had deserved more than the record had given him, and a moment in a corridor that the official story had walked past without stopping. He gave what he had written to Mara. She read it in his kitchen on a Sunday evening while he made tea, and he stayed with his back to her for a long time because he did not want to be in the position of watching her read it. He heard the particular quality of her silence as she went through it, which changed several times in the course of the reading. At the end, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, without inflection, without the weight that would have made it unbearable for him, "Dad." He turned around. He put the tea in front of her. She looked at him across the kitchen table and said, "You should have been writing your whole life." He said, "I was doing something else." She understood that this was not a complaint. It was simply true. He had been doing something else. He had been standing at the edge of things, making sure that things were safe, holding what passed through, being the person whose being there meant that what happened inside the boundary mattered, had weight, had a witness. He had been doing that for 22 years, and it had cost him the way most important things cost. Not obviously, not all at once, but in the steady small payments that add up to an enormous sum when you look at the accounting from a certain angle. Mara kept the writing. She made copies. She told him, in the months that followed, that she had let Clara read it, with his permission, and he had given it because Clara had the same right to the story as he did, arguably more, and that Clara had sat with it for a long time, and then said very little except that she was glad it existed. The notebook with its crossings out, and second attempts, and the accumulated weight of a winter's worth of honest reckoning sat on Mara's shelf next to books she actually read, and photographs, and the small collected evidence of a life in progress. Dennis knew it was there. He never asked about it. He had done what he could with it. The rest was up to what happened next. He retired from Earl Haig Gardens in his late 60s, in a ceremony that the estate organized with a warmth that surprised him, though it shouldn't have. Residents he had not known were paying that close of attention came to the small gathering in the day room. The same day room where Albert had sat in the afternoons, and said things about him that he received with the careful dignity of a man who is grateful, but slightly baffled to find himself at the center of a room. He shook hands. He said thank you several times. He stood at the edge of the gathering, old habit, and watched the people he'd spent 22 years watching, and tried to absorb the fact that this was the last time he would stand at this particular edge in this particular role. The new gatekeeper was a young man from Tottenham, 26, with a serious face and good shoes. Dennis spent 3 days overlapping with him, showing him the rhythms of the place, the things that were not in any handbook. Mrs. Okafor's Wednesday deliveries that always arrived 15 minutes earlier than scheduled, the way the wind came through the gap in the east fence during the winter in a way that required a particular adjustment of posture if you didn't want to be cold all morning, the names and habits and small dignities of the people who passed through the gate every day and deserved to be known. The young man listened well. Dennis decided he would probably be fine. On his last day, Dennis stood at the gate for a final time at the end of his shift. He was not sentimental. He did not stay longer than the shift required. But he did stand for a moment in the particular quality of autumn late afternoon and look at the path and the buildings and the garden where Albert had tilted his face toward the spring sun and let it be what it was, which was a place where important things had happened and where he had been the man at the edge of those things and where that had been enough. He closed the gate behind him. He walked to the bus stop. He sat down. The bus took him home. In the years that followed his retirement, Dennis lived a quiet life in North London, visiting Mara and her family, occasionally being dragged to cricket matches by a grandson who had inherited, apparently from thin air, the old man Osei's passion for the game, which Dennis found both amusing and just slightly impossible to explain. He read more. He walked. He sat in the garden on good afternoons and watched the light the way Albert had watched it, with the patience of someone who has earned the particular luxury of paying attention to small things. Clara sent him a letter on the anniversary of Albert's death each year. It was always brief. It was always enough. He never spoke publicly about what he had heard in that corridor. He had made that choice a long time ago, and it was not a choice he revisited. The fragment stayed where it was, in the writing, in the memory, in the care of the people he trusted with it. The Princess Royal's words to an old soldier in a quiet corridor at Earl Haig Gardens were not his to release into the world. But the fact that they had happened, that the moment had existed, that a woman who could have been anywhere had chosen to be there, and had said something true to a man who needed to hear it, and had been heard by a gatekeeper who understood that being at the edge of things was not the same as being outside of them. That fact was real, and he had made sure it would not dissolve when he did. Some stories don't make the official record. They live in the people who were close enough to witness them and careful enough to hold what they witnessed. They travel through families and through handwritten pages and notebooks that smell of a particular winter. They arrive at a granddaughter reading aloud to her children from something her grandmother kept, or a son asking his father what he remembers, or a woman named Clara sitting in a kitchen somewhere holding a copy of something and feeling for a moment that her father had been seen, not by the record, but by a person with the specific and irreplaceable weight of one human being truly attending to another. Dennis Greaves stood at a gate for 22 years. He held what passed through. He protected what needed protecting. He was not in the official story, and he would have found the suggestion that he should be slightly ridiculous. But he was there. He was the man at the edge. And the edge is where the real things happen. That is the whole of it. And it is enough.